Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor. I am a white man and I am wearing a black t-shirt and a backwards baseball cap and my headphones. And behind me are some floating bookshelves. And to my left is a painting of a dog. And then on my right is the back of my sleeping cat, Luna. We're so pleased this evening to welcome Leona Godin uh, to our At Home at Literati series in support of their plant eyes. She'll be joined in conversation this evening by James Tate Hill. Just a quick webinar overview one more time for our attendees. The chat function of the webinar is closed, but you may want to keep the chat window open during the event as I will be dropping links to purchase their plant eyes from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature that's on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. And I will ask a selection at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. So please, whenever the spirit moves you, don't hesitate to use the Q&A feature to ask a question. Tonight, we're joined by Selena and Lori from ProBono ASL, who will be providing ASL interpretation. And just a reminder that if you cannot see interpretation and you need to, you can make sure to set gallery view on your Zoom, and you should be able to see everybody. Automated closed captioning is also available on your toolbar, and cart captioning and a transcript will be available when we upload this event recording to our YouTube channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are now open to the public. We just ask that you please come with a mask. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming, whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming. You can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Leona Godin is a writer, performer, and educator who is blind. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Playboy, O, the Oprah Magazine, and Catapult, where she writes the column A Blind Writer's Notebook. She was a 2019 Logan Nonfiction Fellow and has written and produced 2 theatrical productions, The Star of Happiness, based on Helen Keller's time performing on vaudeville, and The Spectator and the Blind Man, about the invention of Braille. She founded the online magazine Aromatica Poetica as a venue for exploring the arts and sciences of smell and taste, not specifically for, but welcoming to, blind readers and writers. She holds a PhD in English literature from NYU and has lectured on art, accessibility, disability, and technology at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, Rice University, and the American Printing House for the Blind, among other venues. And joining her in conversation this evening, James Tate Hill is an editor for Monkey Bicycle and contributing editor at Literary Hub, where he writes a monthly audiobooks column. The Best American Essays has chosen 2 of his works as notable, and he won the Nielsen Literary Prize for a first novel for Academy Gothic. Born in West Virginia, he lives in Greensboro, North Carolina. Please join me in welcoming into your living rooms Leona Godin and James Tate Hill.
Hello, thank you, John.
Hello. That was, thank you, John, and going to start things off just with what we'll call an access check, where I and Leona, like John did, will just describe ourselves visually for any blind attendees who are curious what your screens are showing you. And I am a white male of unspecified age, now 40 something, brown hair, green eyes. I have on a black t-shirt. You probably can't see, but it's a Berlin concert t-shirt from the last time I was able to attend a concert in person in 2019. And take it away, Leona.
Thank you, JT. And this is Leona here. I am a white woman with long brown hair. I've got some purple sunglasses on, and I'm wearing a black dress with a little cameo, and behind me is a purple wall with some nice refreshed pastel flowers next to my book, strategically placed there, product placement. So thank you so much, JT, for joining me today.
I am so happy to be here. As you said in a tweet earlier, it's so wild that we have books that could not be more different, but also could not be more similar and share so much DNA coming out in the same summer. And thank you for paving the path and for writing this book, which I could not be more honored to have offered a blurb for. It's probably the only time I will ever have already pre-ordered a book and then be asked to blurb it. So I was like, wow. I mean, my endorsement could not have been more enthusiastic, and I'll try not to be so blatantly effusive because we're going to have a conversation here. But
but I think I saw that tweet and I was like, oh, I got him.
Yeah, and sure enough, you know, I read the PDF or whatever version the digital advanced copy was in, and now I get a whole different experience of you narrating the audiobook, which we can talk about a little bit later on. But I just want to start off by asking if you could describe when and how you knew that this was going to be a book, when, because this is it's such an enormous undertaking. It's a big project. It spans a lot of history. It spans a lot of topics. But at the same time, so many of these topics and thoughts, I'm sure you've been thinking about most of your life. So when did it sort of in your head become the makings of a book?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's such a great way of putting it, because it's true. Like, so many of these ideas I've been playing with in different capacities for at least a couple of decades. I mean, there's some of my dissertation got kind of reworked into some of the centered chapters, hopefully a little bit more accessibly than it was the first time around. So that was kind of like the 17th, 18th century stuff. There's stuff that I kind of explored through theater that kind of got reworked into the book. So like the Helen Keller stuff, her performing in vaudeville, that kind of got reworked into the book. And even going back further, the kind of classical stuff was all the way back from when I was a classicist, not a very good one, but a classics major at UC Santa Cruz, and studying Homer and Milton as a visually impaired person. So there were, some of this material has definitely been simmering for an awfully long time. And the easy answer to this question is I was writing my column for Catapult, and here's where, you know, having kind of writerly friends is a wonderful thing. So I was writing my column for Catapult, and I was also taking classes at Catapult. And one of the people that I became friends with in the online classes turned out to be an editor in disguise, and she just happened to have an agent as a partner, as a life partner, and said, hey, I really loved that column. Do you have an agent? And it was really through that you know, maybe that's not the very sexy answer, but it was really through working with my agent to say, I would love to work with you on a book. And the Catapult column was very much in the pocket of the style of this book. So kind of trying to fuse together, you know, my personal voice with pretty disparate texts and sources and stuff. So the style was there, but it became a book absolutely over the course of 2018 with a lot of help from my agent, Marcus Hoffman. So that's really how it became like a turned from being a bunch of different stuff about blindness to being a book.
Yeah, it's extremely focused, even as it's very broad in the areas that it covers. But I mean, it's so logical, the progression, and everything just links together beautifully, but what I think readers will notice, however they read it, whether through the text or audiobook or braille or some other method, is how consistent and playful your voice is. And because you're dealing with very well-researched literary analysis, history, sociology, and also there's memoir. There's sections where you talk about your own experiences of vision loss. And I mean, it's such a magnetic voice that's funny and irreverent when it has to be, because I think there is, I mean, so much about this book has to be irreverent, because there's so much that we shouldn't be reverent of in the culture's depiction of blindness. And so I want to, excuse me, go back in time before the book, and very early in the book, you revisit seeing doctors when you were 9, 10, very young.
10,
yeah. And that attempt to diagnose, sort of slow moving vision loss at that point, but you're told at some point that this is going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. And much like my own story that I write about in my memoir, you for years, to the detriment of education, and you dropped out of high school because reading became too difficult. And like I did, you tried to pass for sighted in a lot of situations.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could comment. I mean, that links very directly to the need for this book, period. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why people would, like us, would try and pass in certain situations.
Oh my goodness, that is such a great question. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. And I think number one is sort of, I think the buzzword that's come out of this book is ocular centrism, and the idea that that having less sight or no sight is not just different, but wholly deprived, that in any kind of practical sense, I think that there's a lot of people out there that think that not having sight is maybe one of the worst things that could possibly happen to them, other than death, and it's so, all the sort of accoutrement of blindness are so kind of stigmatized and stereotyped, namely, of course, the dreaded white cane, right, that I write about quite a bit, and how hard it is for a lot of us, because so many of us, become blind over time. And so we have all the sort of the trappings, all of the misunderstandings of the sighted world, and then we're entering the blind world, and we're taking those misconceptions with us to our detriment, right? To make it, which makes things so much harder, because not only are we like dealing with adapting, which I think you write in your book as well. It's like humans adapt, like that's what we do. That's like how we've survived, and for better or worse, probably worse, taken over the planet. But we're really good at adapting, and so this idea that we're both going to need to adapt, and at the same time like pretend to be something other than we are, really keeps us from adapting, I think, as well and as swiftly as we ought to. And again, I think it has everything to do with like our kind of ocular centric culture, our stigmatized ideas about the white cane, and then, well, I could just go on and on, but it's such a great question, because it's in many ways, it's why I wrote the book, right? It's why I wanted the book to be sort of this cacophony of blind voices, where it's like, I think it's too often the case that sort of one blind person is kind of held up as kind of an ideal, I mean, of course, Helen Keller is probably most famous, but of course there's Stevie Wonder, and there's just, so many, sort of, mountain climbers and this and that, that are kind of held up as kind of ideal versions of what like a blind person should be. So I think that also makes it really tough for us, right? To kind of be like, okay, either we are going to be pitied, or we're going to be up against like such ridiculous such role models that are just so out of the ordinary that they were so stuck. Yeah.
And either saintly or what's the word I'm looking for?
Supernatural, maybe.
Right. Yeah. The occult of the blind seer, and I guess as you trace portrayals of blindness through Homer, or through Greek plays and Shakespeare and Milton and the Bible, and you realize, obviously these writers who are writing these works are responding to the world in which they live, and I mean it becomes a perpetuating cycle of representation, where this is what they think, and then the art becomes a reflection of their low expectations, or their box in which they put blind people, and then that art becomes canonical and is passed down and taught in classes and schools, and it just becomes the cyclical indoctrination of certain views.
Yes.
And so as you lay the groundwork in the early chapters, and we start seeing how the world starts to slowly tilt. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit, because I find it just utterly fascinating, the story of how blind education first began. And that's sort of in the middle. And that's when I think we start experiencing progress, because there was a limited amount of activity that blind people in 200 BC could do. But a big answer to that is education.
Yes. And I guess that was one of the big things that I wanted to do with this book as well, is kind of tie together blind history, both metaphorically and practically, with just history, sort of literary, cultural history generally. So it was really important for me to kind of make the connection between Enlightenment thought generally and the education of the blind, and how those two things kind of came out of a turning from religion and mythology and literature to science, and really trying to kind of connect, and philosophy as well, and trying to connect the blind educational impulse of the blind to that Enlightenment sort of project of progress. So it was really out of philosophy that that impulse to problematically perhaps cure the blind on the one hand, that was sort of one side of it, and then teach the blind on the other hand. And so I would say that the problematic part of that kind of scientific impulse, like once sort of science in the 17th and 18th centuries kind of get a hold of the blind man, very specifically, like in an essay concerning human understanding by John Locke, there's this kind of philosophical question that was, if a man was born blind and suddenly made to see, and he could distinguish a sphere from a cube by touch, and then suddenly, if he was made to see, would he be able to distinguish the cube and the sphere just by sight alone?
Yeah.
So it set this whole kind of crazy train in motion, and that philosophical question is still kind of known as the Molyneux man, and it's still trotted out like every time somebody spends a good portion of their life blind, and then it does have some sort of operation to gain vision. And it turns out that the answer is really complicated. So that's kind of one side of what happened in the Enlightenment. And then the other side of it, probably prompted by like a Diderot, who started thinking, maybe it's not that great to suddenly see. And in terms of, in fact, it was problematic. Like the very first cataract operations were in the early 18th century, and they were very indifferently successful. Like the one kid that actually Oliver Sacks talks about, and it's kind of in the literature as one of the first cataract operations. The kid can see physically, but because his brain had not learned how to see, he had a lot of trouble. And it's interesting because that kind of happens through the centuries. So Diderot, before these operations even happened, or right in the beginning of when cataract operations started happening, said, well, maybe we should stop worrying about, like, giving sight, which is always kind of indifferently useful. It can be very misleading even to those who have, for a long time, he says, enjoyed its use, the use of sight. Maybe we should start to think about like what the blind person can tell us about sight or about other aspects of the world. And so he sort of ponders that question. And really soon after that, with that kind of Enlightenment impulse, this guy named Valentin Hauy, or we like to call him Howie because it's just easier. H-A-U-Y, very odd name. So he gets this idea that, maybe I should try educating the blind. And so that's really where it starts. So it's kind of like right smack in the middle of the Enlightenment in France, in the middle of the 18th century. So these two, so the blind man is sort of intimately connected with this project. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things you start to see in the non-literal sense in your book is, and that's the other problematic thing, is we equate sight just verbally with knowledge and blindness with ignorance. And I appreciate how many of these linguistic tics that are tantamount to ableism that you point out, but in a non-scolding, playful way. I hope
so. I'm glad you say that, because I do feel like people are worried, like they get scared, right? Suddenly that I'm saying like never use the word see, and that's definitely not what I want to do. So thank you for saying that it's sort of playfully being made aware of.
And I think so much with so much comes down to intent, and if someone is trying their best and trying, like the pronunciation of somebody's name, if they're asking you to pronounce, if you're asking someone how to pronounce their name and you're giving it your best shot, it's a lot less offensive than just calling them whatever you think it is. And so much of it comes down to an attempt and making progress in that way.
Right.
But jumping a lot forward, and again, you so delightfully blend memoir with so many of these other topics. So there's always these seamless transitions into your own experience. And
thank you. I mean, there was an editor behind some of those seamless transitions.
Yeah, God
I must
bless
say there
editors.
there was definitely a messier version of this book that I need to call attention to it and yet forget it at the same time. But yes, thank you.
So and we sort of came up in a similar time period, and probably had the same evolution of our own education through technology, which has made such leaps and bounds in the past 20 to 30 years.
Yes.
Without even getting into the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was 30 years ago, but which is its own ball of wax that we won't be able to unfurl here, but you do pay attention to that in the book. But I wondered if there was, because you described dropping out of high school, and then you of course go on to complete a PhD and a dissertation and publish a book that was praised yesterday by the New Yorker. So I wondered if there was some kind of adaptation or some kind of assistive technology that you experienced when you did enter community college and then college that made you think, okay, I can do this.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like you had kind of a similar experience where I just got no help in high school. I mean, absolutely no help. And I've heard this from other people that were sort of, it seemed like it was especially true for all of us that were missing like the central vision, because I think this is true for you as well. And also like my friend Andy Slater also had this experience of like not being able to read or see details, but being able to totally pass, and like not trying to pass, but we had our peripheral vision. So there was no need for the most part at that time in my life for a cane or a dog. But I couldn't read. I had no central vision, so it was like, that was kind of problematic at the time, because if you had any kind of residual vision, not only did people not recognize it, but also it was very much the impulse in those days, and from what I've heard even today, unfortunately, to try and get kids like us to read like large print for as long as possible. And there's this really amazing, so sad and yet amazing article in the New York Times that I cite in the book that is about this mom who wants to get her kid trained, learning Braille, because it's clear that she can't read normal size print, and it's not going to get better, and the teachers are like, oh, well, she's fine. She can read 72 point font, and the mom is like, well, what is she, this is fine for C-spot run, but what is she going to do when she has to read, Dickens or something, and they were like, oh, well, she'll just use audio. And it's a big argument in my book that it's like, I do feel kind of strongly that, kids that were in my position, 10 years old and clearly not going to get vision back anytime soon, that, we're kind of forced into doing things a certain way that seems more passable. And actually this speaks to your first question too, is like, why do we try to pass? Because usually like adults in our lives are like, oh, if you can kind of hang on to looking sighted, for as long as you can, and you get compliments, right? Like, oh, you don't look blind, and like the knee-jerk reaction is to be like, thank you,
Yeah, exactly.
And then talk about, internalized ableism and just feeling really crappy about yourself, right? Is that like, you have to be thankful for looking like something other than what you are, right? So
and you start to congratulate yourself for those things
too. Exactly. So, but absolutely, the first thing that happened was when I entered City College of San Francisco. Luckily, I had had a really good like grade school education. So it was like all of my friends were going to college. So I think that there was never really an idea in me that said, I'm not going to go to college. It was just like, how am I going to do this? Right. So I was just miserable in high school and went to City College and finally got hooked up with books on tape. At that time was the big thing. And then there was shame there too, right? With the books on tape, it was so embarrassing. They were so clunky. There was no such thing as like the sexy, audiobook download that we have now. So it was like, again, I was a huge reader, but hid all my books in drawers and stuff, because the books were in these really unsexy plastic boxes.
They were all stamped on every side with recordings for the blind. I was like, oh, how am I going to hide this?
I know. And I remember I got drawers for my, for my books. And I told somebody that, like, I let it slip one time and they were like, you got drawers for your book? Like, as opposed to shelves for your books? And I was like, no, I mean, Shell, it was like, so it was like, and then absolutely like that first computer, because then I could still read large print. So I could, I could get pretty much any kind of computer. And luckily at the time, my boyfriend was a computer geek and downloaded some enlargement software. And I was like, oh my God, I can see what I'm typing, because I learned how to touch type. And I was like, my first year in City College, I was just like literally blindly touch typing, my papers, which did not go well, as you might imagine, in terms of typos and such. So so the computer was absolutely game changing, no doubt about it. Yeah.
And I was in my second graduate program before I had a screen reader. And so, even as
were you using large print for all that time?
I was using just human assistance.
Okay.
I could blow up my Microsoft font large enough so that I could very tediously spell check. And that was my revision process, was spell
Right.
checking. I mean, and I was, finally, when I was in a creative writing program, I was like, oh, I think I describe it in the book as it felt like a superpower that I could actually edit my own stories now.
Yes.
Before, I
Yeah.
was like, I couldn't read the handwriting of the professors. I could maybe make out if they said to put a comma there. If I could find that passage with select find, I would put the comma there, and boom, that must be a perfect story now that it has that comma.
Right. Yes.
But you mentioned audio, and this is my next transition. So we were talking on the phone, and I mean, audiobooks have become destigmatized in the last 5, maybe 10 years, but really just the last 5 or 6 years. It's the audiobooks boom, and I've written about this to sort of trace the role technology plays now that everybody can very conveniently access audiobooks on their smartphone. And I think the rise of the podcast created a thirst for audiobooks as well. And is there still a stigma? Absolutely. If you ever publish an article or essay that's titled "Do audiobooks count as reading?" wait until the trolls just start typing no without actually reading, ironically, the entire essay. But there is still, sadly, but those are also the people who are probably never going to think with an open mind about a lot of important topics, and I'll leave it at that. But you and I in the 80s and the 90s was the cassette tape era. I don't think the CD ever really truly took off, although they still make them. But
I know when people talk about CDs, it's like, I'm sorry, you're ordering what now?
But I was so excited. Kira Grunenberg, who I think I met through you, asked if my audiobook, A Blind Man's Bluff, was going to come out on CD. And I was like, yeah, it is. She goes, great. That's how I would like it. And I was like, there we go. There is an audience.
Kira, we're going to do a double shout out to Kira, because she asked me the same thing. And I was like, do they do that? I didn't even know that they still publish
they do, but
CDs. I don't even know. Right. Hey, Pantheon, do I have a CD of my book? I don't even know.
I think you probably do if you go, but it's to date myself at my high school graduation night celebration, where they had casino games and you could win tickets and then bid on things. I got a Discman. So
my goodness, I haven't heard that word in a long time.
Yeah. So that's how weird it is for CD books to still exist. But anyway, it's that's my transition to how technology now, we're listening and reading audiobooks on small devices or smartphones that are the size of a deck of cards. And the way that technology has allowed people like you and me to even narrate. I'm not going to ultimately be narrating my own audiobook for reasons we can get into in August, but I love that you did yours. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the process, which you explain a little bit in the prefatory note. And what I love about the prefatory note of your audiobook is, as you say, I'm just explaining that there are different ways of reading. I hope you enjoy this one.
Yes. Yeah. We decided to pull back the curtain, and say, I am reading using an earbud in my ear. I like to call it the electronic Cyrano method of
You've
reading.
given me a name for it.
And, the passionless Cyrano. And so I kind of felt like it was really important, because to be honest, none of us were really sure if it was going to work out. I mean, I had done lots of readings, like performance type readings, but I think, like you as well, when you're doing it by ear, you practice a lot. And so that's always how I had done it. So I kind of went into it thinking I was going to kind of do it the same way. I used to cut my lines really short. And this actually came about because I started lecturing as a teacher. I was like, I realized that if I put really huge margins on my whatever, my lecture notes or whatever, then I could kind of just scroll down easily and catch bits and phrases and be able to kind of keep up with my lecture, but also kind of, talk off the cuff. And then when I ran out of stuff, I could find stuff pretty easily. So that's where it sort of started. And then, but it was so amazing. I mean, this is where, you talk, like, I think we're both a little bit still so amazed. I mean, I know I am. It's like how wonderful it is to have a fellow blind writer, to have somebody that's kind of coming up at the same time. I mean, you're ahead of me because you have a book behind you, a wonderful, fun, hilarious novel, by the way, Academy Gothic, but coming along with our book about the same time, because I remember so distinctly of being like, wait, how do you do this? Because I read your book and I was like, oh, he does the, the audio method as well. And then I realized that you were doing it in a totally different way than I had ever thought of doing it, which is, using the Victor reader stream and kind of like basically following along. And so for a second there, I was like, oh, should I do it that way? And God bless them, Penguin Random House Audio. I mean, they kind of muscled through all of my I don't know how I'm going to have the same PDF as what the engineer is going to have. Like, I just don't know how that's going to happen. And so we kind of went back and forth. And for a minute, I was like, should I do it? Should I do it like how JT does it? And I even got a Victor reader stream and I was like, no, I don't think that's the way for me. And then I finally figured out that actually it's not that big of a deal for me to just have my book in a Word document, and that was better too, because that way I could change stuff. Like I could add commas and stuff, and I could put pauses in. But I did learn from you, like I had never done this before, where I did kind of the runaway train version of this. Like I said, I always used to scroll down, kind of arrow down with my finger one line at a time. And so for the book, for the first time, I did it more like you, where I just let my screen reader play. And then when I needed to pause, I would pause and kind of start the sentence over again or whatever. But, and that was really great because that was kind of a new way of doing things that made it at least possible to not have to practice quite so much. Again, I did spend a lot of time fixing the text and putting the commas in and stuff, but it was so funny because the director at some point, we actually did it via Zoom. So I was in the same, studio as the engineer, but the director, I mean, I don't know if people know this, but it's a huge production to get these really great sounding audiobooks. So there's an engineer, there's a director, there's me in my own little room with the microphone, and then later on, of course, there's the editor that does their magic and stuff, and there was also an executive producer as well. So there's a lot of people, and it was the first time that I was doing a reading that was like that much pressure. It was like one thing to do a little basement reading or a little bookstore reading or something, and there's another thing to have so much, I mean, frankly, money writing on this thing, and there was a lot of stress, I will say, but it was funny because I was in the little sound booth, and so the director couldn't see me, and she kept saying, I don't know if your machine can do this, and I was like, no, it's just a laptop, I was like, it's just a laptop, just like what you have. It just have an earbud in here. And she was like, I just could not get it, could not imagine that what I was doing had anything to do with sort of the everyday mundane reality.
It's a specialized machine.
Yeah. I'm like, no, it's just a crappy little HP that made a lot of noise with its fan, that I was like, oh, my HP is so quiet. And then of course, for the entirety of the recording, there's this fan sound going on.
Right.
But I mean, I'm so glad I did it. I think that if I knew just how hard it was going to be, I probably wouldn't have done it. But by the end, I got pretty good, I have to say. I think people will hear the progression. I was actually just talking to a friend of mine, and she said, yeah, you can definitely tell you get more comfortable as you move along. But to speak to what you were saying before about kind of reading, listening, we were talking about how it was so interesting because for a lot of audiobooks, they actually do edits on the fly for audiobooks to change reader to listener. So it's not in the text. Yes. And it kills me too. And so that was another thing that my director and I, we kind of, we butted heads a little bit because I was like, I don't I just realized that my whole introduction, my whole little prefatory remark has everything to do with the fact that listeners are also readers. Like when you're concentrating on listening to a book, that is reading. That has how I've always read. I mean, I can kind of do it with my fingers now, but like you were saying, what did you say? Like, oh, what would you say if you were touching it, like Dear Touchers or something? Yeah. If you were thinking about the Braille reader. So it's like, it was funny because even you noticed that like the first one I forgot, and I thought we had actually gone back and re-recorded it, but I guess we didn't. But there's one little rogue dear listeners in there, but I think we tried to I fought to keep the reader in there. So
and it's
hopefully.
So widespread. I mean, it's very rare. And it makes me bristle every time that I'm like, why? I mean, we understand that this is the text of the book. We understand that we're using our ears. I don't need the entire text to be altered to remind me that this is how I'm reading the book.
Yes.
I
think that will change. I hope that will change, because I think that, man, I really hope that we can make a change, right? Because it's like, because it belittles, right? There's something sort of belittling about saying that as audio listeners, as audio people who absolutely are so invested in words, right? I mean, that's what we do all day long, is read and write, right? And it's almost all, aside from, I'm assuming you're also a touch typer, right? So typing
just
typing in and audio out basically is usually the way. So it kind of, there's something belittling, like, oh, it's fun to read an audio book, but it's serious to read a print book or something, it's like,
it's still the same 11-hour commitment of paying attention. And I am retaining the exact same. I mean, this is a whole other talk, but but I just wanted to, I just checked the time, and I know we're going to save time for Q&A. And if anybody wants to start dropping any questions in the chat box, feel free to do so. But I just one last question before we get to Q&A. One of my favorite chapters of the book is talking about representations of the blind in popular culture and literature, and the ways that blind people are not allowed to be to fully inhabit the same space that other people inhabit. And by that I mean, we're not allowed to be sexual on the page or in movies, with rare exceptions. And the Raymond Carver short story Cathedral being one of those most famous literary examples, where it's never even entertained the possibility. And we both know Gillian Weisse, who wrote that great poem from the wife's point of view, that reimagines that she did have a damn affair with the blind man, because why wouldn't he, if he went on to marry the next woman who was his reader? But I wondered if you would talk a little bit, because you've also written, I think it was for Playboy, where you talked about blind dating, literal blind dating. And it's such a fun, but also just illuminating article too. And I love that you go to all those places. It's not just a study of literature and sociology and history. I mean, these are things that people are immensely curious about.
And well, it was so important for me, and that's why the blind memoir, although there are memoir kind of anecdotes sprinkled throughout my book, I draw upon many memoirs, and also sort of just chatting with friends and stuff. So really with this book, I'm trying to kind of rub the canonical texts up against lived blind experience, and so that's where, like, my friends, where I'll be like, I might be talking about Raymond Carver right in this paragraph, but the next paragraph I'm going to be talking about, my friends Lori Rubin and Caitlin Hernandez and Michelle Kleinberg, who, we had this really fun conversation about, face touching, because I was like, am I the only one that thinks that, like, face touching is something that only happens in books and in the movies? And so I, wrote them an email, because we had kind of a little blind writers group. for a while there, and I was like, face touching, what do you guys think of it? And everybody was like, no, like we don't do that.
Yeah.
And so, the biggest problem, and I mean, this is kind of my soapbox for this tour, is like the biggest problem is not like, do you say see, or do you use sort of, the language, sightist language or whatever. The biggest problem is that we're not creating the metaphors. We're not creating the characters, we have not been allowed beyond memoir for the most part to really create the blind characters that are so powerful in our imagination. And so that's why we haven't been able to, like, mention to the world that, hello, yes, we have sex too, who knew? Because sighted people are like, no, you're all saints or beggars or superheroes or
as you point out, it's I mean, disability is still lagging behind in other forms of representation, like diversity statements. And I mean, as you start to see, we become a more diverse, culturally accepting society, full of empathy, when narratives that haven't traditionally been centered get to be centered. And we're no longer supporting characters or the experiences that have so long been stereotyped and marginalized are finally, we're shining a light on those experiences and letting blind writers tell their stories, which, lo and behold, are really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think there's still lots of room, right? I mean, I don't know how it was for you with your novel, but I mean, that's certainly one of the few own voices, blind character novels that I know of, and I do think there's kind of a big divide between kind of allowing us to write memoirs and then allowing us to write like authentic blind characters or something.
Right.
I'm not sure why.
You address that really, really well by talking to the romance writer who herself is blind, and that's another favorite chapter. And I could go on and on, but I want to throw it over to John to see if he has questions for us yet.
Grand.
There are no questions just yet. Remind folks that they can use the Q&A feature that's on the toolbar if they'd like to submit a question. But James, perhaps I toss it back to you. If there's a last question that you might have for Leona.
I've got all kinds.
and then we can, ask JT about his book now if we run out of things. So we could be here all day. So all
we
night.
could.
I think we've got time for maybe one question. So James, you can take it away. If anyone wants to submit a question, I can try to fit it in at the end here as well.
Okay.
So just remind you to use the Q&A.
Well, just in a sort of fun note, Leona, what surprised you in your research?
Well, like we said at the top, I've been working on some of this stuff for such a long time. What I've been saying to answer that question is that, I do think that we have to be a little kinder to each other as blind people, to realize that there are differences. Like, I think we recognize it with kind of us versus the sighted. It's like, hey, we're not all the same. We're not a monolith. But I think within the blind community, we need to be a little bit more generous with like how we do things, whether it be Braille or audio or large print or whatever. But in the way back, right, I remember that there was a moment when I was writing my dissertation that I just happened to run across this book called The Radical Lives of Helen Keller. And so I kind of left my dissertation just for an afternoon. And those were the days when, again, it was really hard to get ebooks. So I scanned the whole book in. It sounded really interesting. And it was about her radical politics, which I think people are starting to recognize a little bit more these days, that she was a full-on socialist, total lefty, right? Which, as far as I'm concerned, is awesome. So, but there was this little throwaway line that was like, oh yeah, this was not what she planned after her Radcliffe degree, but she ended up spending 4 years performing in vaudeville. And I was like, what? She did what? And I'll never forget that moment of just feeling like, almost like gypped, like, how could I know about Helen Keller all my life? You know, I wasn't young at the time, you know, I was in my 30s or whatever, late 20s, early 30s. And it was like, how could I have, you know, heard about the miracle worker and the story of my life and this like this name that's everywhere and not known this interesting fact? And of course, at the time I was performing, I was kind of going to moonlighting as like a performance artist or whatever in little black box theater. So it was like, at that moment, I think that's probably one of the big things that kind of sent me down this path of this book, you know, is realizing like how complicated even these monolithic figures are, let alone all of us, right? That like even this iconic figure had this huge thing that was like 4 years out of her life that nobody wanted to touch because it felt like sort of embarrassing. Like that's not what you're supposed to do as a blind person. You're not supposed to be performing in a lowbrow theater situation, you know? And so I think that was one of those surprising facts. And there's lots of them that I kind of try and bring into the book, but that was probably one of the first that really said, wait a minute, I need to explore this blind thing in a way that's different than, as you started out saying, than that kind of like reverential way that we tend to do. So
yeah, and if I remember correctly, that the Q&A at those vaudeville shows got pretty wild. Yeah.
Yes. Oh my God. Speaking of Q&A, yes, the vaudeville audience were not so shy as our audiences this evening. Yes. It's funny because I mean, her and Annie Sullivan, kind of knew that there was going to be a Q&A, and they had been doing the lecture circuit, like sort of the Chautauqua circuit type thing for a couple of years. So they knew about, you know, Q&As and stuff. And so they had drawn up a list of possible questions so that she was at least partly prepared. But they were just all over the place, for everything from like, you know, what do you think of capitalism? You know, which I think her answer was like, oh, well, I think it's outgrown its usefulness. To, you know, like, do you dream at night, or, you know, or do you see in your dreams, or, you know, what do you think of light, or, you know, can you tell my future? Or thankfully we haven't gotten that on the tour yet. Like there's been no calls for me to fortune tell but she was definitely called upon. But she also, like, to some of the questions, they were very serious, you know, kind of, who do you think are the most important people of your day? And I think she mentions like Charlie Chaplin as being one of them. I can't remember who else, but also like she got to talk about kind of Harvard's discrimination against Jewish people and Black people. And so she was really able to use the vaudeville as a platform for her politics. So it was kind of like, it was almost unfair for this book that was so interested in her radical politics to kind of dismiss it, because it was not separate in her own mind, you know.
But that chapter on Helen Keller, just for me, not knowing nearly enough about her, really gave me a three-dimensional view of her as somebody who had fun, somebody who had a romantic life, albeit, you know, not
short.
right. No spoilers, but I mean, it's just the whole person that you were able to restore in that chapter.
Yeah, which is so sadly lacking, I think, in that. Yeah, those wild oscillations that we tend to have in our cultural representations. Well, I think that so much of it too is like it's so rare that the blind character is like the protagonist, right? That they're not allowed to be kind of the full round characters that literature wants out of, you know, demands their characters be. You know, it's very rarely that the blind person is that. They tend to be kind of somebody who kind of enters into the life of the sighted protagonist and changes it dramatically somehow.
We do have a question from the audience, and I think this will be our first and last question for the audience this evening.
Brave
as we're
soul.
reaching the top of the hour. But David writes, you write of a sense of camaraderie in the underground performance scene, and there seems to be less access where money is to be made, movies, TV, books, etc. Are you aware of other scenes, IRL or digital, which are specifically oriented to the blind or otherwise disabled creative?
Ooh, the blind or disabled creative. So actually making the theater or making the movies. You know what? There's more. Did I understand that? JT,
The
did I
question
under?
That's, yeah.
are you aware of other scenes outside of maybe
Mm,
movies, TV, books, etc., or traditional media,
right.
artistic scenes which are specifically oriented to the blind or to other disabled communities, to the creative communities within them?
Yeah. You know, well, there was like, theater by the blind in New York. I mean, there's, oh goodness, Heidi Latsky Dance is doing a lot of stuff with disabled performers. I mean, there's so much stuff. Chicago is like sort of famously got a ton of stuff going on for disabled creatives. Amazingly, I mean, I do say that like it tends to be that disability is not included in statements of diversity in like say big grants and fellowships where I think creatives get that ability to actually create in doing something new that's not already mainstream or whatever. But there was a major award last year given for the first time called Disability Futures, a huge grant given to disabled creatives. In terms of scenes, I just had this conversation with my friend Alice, who you were referring to, who's a blind writer, a blind romance writer. And she was talking about how she felt like when she was doing theater, that she was just sort of more accepted as a blind person in kind of the theater world. And I guess that's what I found as well when I was doing a lot of performance stuff, that we all kind of think of ourselves as sort of freaks, and so the blindness was sort of like just kind of part of that underground world. So
Yeah.
I would say it didn't have to be specifically for disability, but I would say where you have a lot of like really kind of wild, forward thinking creatives in a room, as a blind person, you're going to feel a lot more comfortable than, cruising most streets, I would say. So,
Yeah. Wherever there's a punk rock ethos.
yeah, exactly.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour. Leona Godin, James Tate Hill, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you for
at
having
Thanks,
us.
John. Thank
Literati this
you to
evening, of course.
Literati.
And of
Thank
course, you
you.
can pre-order James's book, Blind Man's Bluff, on our website as
Uh-huh.
well. And
And you
we'll hope to
should.
have perhaps both of you back in August.
That would be
And
great.
yeah, thank you as well to our interpreters this evening and to all of our attendees. Thank you so much for joining us.
If
We
I could
hope to
say
see
something
you.
real quick,
Oh, of course.
I noticed that if you're an audiobook reader, I noticed Literati has partnered up with Libro FM, so you do not have to use the big monolith of audiobooks, and you can buy your audiobooks straight from your cool favorite indie bookstore, and they
Yeah.
actually get supported through that.
Yes, thank you so much for mentioning that. I am an avid user of Libro FM. It's wonderful. Anything you can get on the big monolith, you can get on Libro,
Yes.
and
Yes.
Literati sees a bit of the proceeds. So we appreciate that plug for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you both again for joining us, and
Thanks
we'll
for
hope to
having
see
us.
you
It's been
soon.
awesome.
Of course. And to all of our attendees, have a great evening, and we'll see you at the next event. Bye
Thanks,
all.
JT. Thanks,
Thank you,
John. Bye,
Leona.
all.
Bye.